Good evening to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our veranda number 102. This is a very special veranda organized in a partnership with the Alana Institute. We're going to discuss data protection for children and adolescents in digital environments. Our event will include several accessibility resources. We have simultaneous translation, interpretation for the hearing disabled. We have closed caption. You can choose your channel on the Zoom platform or on the YouTube in English or Portuguese. I am Janaína Costa. I am a researcher and I will describe myself. I am a white woman with dark hair. I am in front of a white wall with nothing else on it, and I'm wearing a blue blouse and a silver necklace. So to begin, thank you all who are here and to our speakers. They will introduce themselves in a few moments. We are discussing a very serious topic. Data protection for children and adolescents must be thoroughly discussed because the children are being born and raised in this context of digitalization. And when a child or a teenager opens an app, plays a game on site, or visits a web page, his data begins to be collected, and we are traced and profiled, and this can cause a major impact in our future and in our rights. Databases use information they collect, banks, insurance companies, they base the premiums that we pay on what they collect from us. And therefore, many different people and companies can collect our data to decide on, for example, employers to decide who they will choose to fill in a job. In legal courts, also, they do data collection to decide whether somebody is a potential criminal. And in this context, many questions come up. What are the consequences of the data-driven society for children and teenagers who are in a very important growth phase and who should be enabled to have to experiment and not leave the digital footprints that we leave many times since the day we are born. I will give the floor to our host, Pedro Hartung, and then he will describe himself and then invite our speakers. Thank you, Janaína. It is a pleasure. Good evening to all our public. Very good to be here in the Varanda ITS. We have a very fruitful partnership, and I hope we can have a very good dialogue on a very important topic. I am Pedro. I am a white man. I have a beard and wear eyeglasses. There is an accordion and a piano behind me, and also a picture on the wall. I am the director for children's policies at Alana Institute. I am a lawyer and a researcher of digital rights and children's rights. In the same tone that Janaína brought to us about the importance of our discussion today, we have been participating in many discussions about personal data protection, but children and adolescents are being left out of this discussion. Our focus today is to bring the discussion on personal data protection for children on the web and to discuss their needs. As Janaína described, children and teenagers are in a growing phase. So from 0 to 18 years of age, they are in a very sensitive phase, or from 13 to 18, and they deserve special attention. And inviting our guest speakers and also at the same time bringing a question to inspire them, I would like to hear from you, first of all, your audio description, but also please elaborate on the following reflection. How can we understand the digital environment, the inclusion of children and adolescents in this environment, and at the same time, how can we deal with the regulatory dimension of data protection in today's world? aiming at protecting children and adolescents. So how do you see the protection of the best interests of children and adolescents in the digital environment? And to start, I will bring our international guest, Josh Golan, so that he can talk to us and give us his ideas on this topic.
Thank you so much, Pedro, and thank you to Alana and ITS for hosting this important event. I am a white male. I am 49 years old. I have a beard. I am wearing a blue and white striped shirt, and there is a blue wall and a couple of white doors behind me. I am the executive director of the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood, an advocacy group in the United States. And I often get asked, what do we mean by a commercial-free childhood? Do we mean that everybody should move to the woods, that we should cover up children's eyes if they go past a billboard? And we don't mean any of those things. What we mean is something quite simple, that the primary influences in a child's life, the institutions and the people, should primarily care about that child's well-being. But children have influences in their life, a tremendous influence. They spend a huge amount of time online these days where they are influenced by the media and marketing that they are exposed to online. And that media and marketing is not designed for their well-being necessarily, it's designed for profit. And that may be obvious, but I think it's really important context. I think it's the forest through the trees that sometimes we forget. So when we talk about in recent years, this explosion of data that is being collected from young people, the way they are tracked across websites, the way they are tracked across their devices, where every video they watch, every game they play, every picture and video that they post, every post that they like, who their friends are, who their friends' friends are, all of that information is constantly being collected from them, and it's not being collected for their good. It's being collected to drive profits for the platforms and for advertisers. And I think that that's something that we really have to understand when we start talking about this, because it has profound effects on children's development, but it's not necessarily good effects because it's not even designed to be good for them. It's designed in order to drive profits. Let me talk about a few specific concerns. First of all of this data collection makes advertising worse. Children are more vulnerable to advertising than adults. Advertising is a factor in many of the major problems facing children, like childhood obesity, eating disorders, materialistic values, family conflict, sexualization of children. And that's just old-fashioned television advertising. When we personalize advertising, when we advertise to a audience of one based on everything that we know about that child, it makes the advertising even more powerful and potentially more harmful. To give just a couple of examples, a couple of years ago, a memo was leaked from Facebook where Facebook was boasting to advertisers that they could target teenagers at the exact moment that they were feeling bad about themselves, including when they were feeling bad about their bodies. So when we think about the struggles that teenagers go through, particularly around things like body image, and to see that as a marketing opportunity, that you can use all of this data in order to target somebody at their most vulnerable, that's incredibly concerning. The other way that media online is primarily monetized is through in-game purchases. And we know that data plays a huge role in that. The app developers look to find the kids that are going to be most vulnerable, who are going to spend the most money. Not to pick on Facebook, but another memo that was leaked from Facebook, they talked about how they were looking for kids who they called whales, who would spend the most money on games. Whales is a term that the casino industry uses to describe really, really high rollers that are responsible for most of their profits. I don't think we really want social media companies or advertisers thinking about children as being whales. Another way that it's incredibly harmful is that it makes the screen time problem worse. There's a fundamental conflict when children are online. I'm not saying that all media is bad for children, but there is a lot of evidence that shows that excessive use of screen media is linked to a number of problems like mental health problems, interruption of sleep, obesity. Some of the most pressing problems are related to spending too much time online and displacing activities that we know that are good for children. For media companies, for the platforms, their motive is to have kids be online as much as possible because that's when kids are worth more money to them. So when we see the way that data is being used in these platforms, it's not being used to promote children's well-being. It's not being used to identify those kids who are spending the most time on a platform and then to nudge them to spend less time, to shut down their accounts for briefly. In fact, it's being used to serve that content that is most likely to keep them on the platform even longer. So again, we have this fundamental thing where Pedro opened by talking about the best interests of children. It's not in the platform's charters to worry about the best interests of children. So all of this data is not being used in children's best interests. And in fact, many times it's being used against their best interests. And finally, the last concern that I'll just raise, which is a little less concrete than some of the others, but I think we need to think about the consequences of indoctrinating children from a very young age into a culture of surveillance. Children today are growing up with no privacy, with everything they're doing is being tracked by companies, being shared with third parties. Predictions are being made about them. They may be accurate, they may not be accurate. But the fact of the matter is that developing children are growing up with no sense of privacy and not even an expectation of privacy. And I think when we think about the 21st century and some of the key problems that are facing us as civil societies, whether it's government surveillance or corporate surveillance, if we're raising children who are accepting of surveillance and just see it as part of the fabric of their lives from birth, I don't think those children are going to be well equipped to challenge that surveillance down the road. So ultimately, I really think, it has to be the role of regulation to put a check on all of this data collection, because the companies, it's just not in their interest to limit their data collection. Their purpose in collecting this data is to drive their bottom lines. And if we're really concerned about the best interests of children, that's got to come from regulation. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Josh, e seja bem-vindo.
Thank you so much, Josh, and again, welcome to our debate. Now I will invite Marilla Monteiro to introduce herself and to give us her first reflections. Thank you, Pedro. Good evening to all of you. Thank you to Alana Institute and ITS for the invitation to participate in such an important event. I am Marilla Monteiro. I am a white woman. I have long blonde hair. I am wearing a virtual background with a colorful screen that ranges from blue to green, purple, and yellow. And there is a phrase that reads "free to be," and I'm wearing a black blouse. Now, beginning with my institution, I am Marilla Monteiro. I am from the public policy team of TikTok in Brazil. And first of all, considering that we are a relatively new and unknown platform to most of the public, I would like to introduce it briefly. TikTok is a short video sharing platform. It offers an infinite loop of videos. The user does not have to look for them actively. They are short, ranging from 15 seconds to 1 minute videos. And TikTok's mission is to bring happiness and joy. People use the software to inspire and to learn content, to share a recipe. Since we have Pedro, a musician with us, many people use TikTok to show their music and in many creative ways. And as an assumption for inspiration and creativity, the TikTok community and its users need to feel safe. So privacy and safety and security in our platform are not only tools, but rather basic pillars, not only for developing our product, but also for developing new tools. Privacy and security are, since the beginning to the final design of the product, they are present. And I use the opportunity of this event and the topic of how we can specifically take care of the privacy and safety of our children and teenage users. First of all, I'd like to make a point that TikTok is not meant for children under 13. So the public that we do not consider proper for our platform, we make an assessment or evaluation in the app stores, allowing parents and tutors to include filters to prevent children under 13 to download the product on their devices. We began with a very broad and multifunctional team of security and safety professionals who are skilled to remove these children online, and we do that actively. In the first screen of TikTok, you need to type in your birth date, and it is designed to have the child inform his or her actual age. And we also work with safety and security partners to monitor this rule and prevent it from being disobeyed. And with the presence of teenagers in TikTok also requires specific control of privacy and security, considering that they are growing individuals, as Pedro and Josh described very well, with different capacities, who deserve specific protection and at the same time a kind of autonomy and independence in their development as human beings. In TikTok, we use specific standards of resources for this public. Some of the controls that are designed in our tool are pioneers in their type in the industry. Last year, for example, we began to block certain functions by age bracket. So users from 13 to 16 cannot use the direct messaging resources at TikTok. They could not use the live streams resources, and users under 18 also could not receive, send, or share the virtual premiums or prizes that TikTok offers. A very interesting tool that TikTok is also pioneering in its development is the Family Sync tool. It is a tool that enables parents and tutors to participate in the online journey together with the teenagers. It's not a vigilance or surveillance tool, but it helps families to define limits for teenagers to use TikTok. So what are the tools that are offered in this Family Sync aspect? The family or the teenager can limit the kind of topics they are exposed to, also certain users or hashtags or content specifically. They can also limit how long they can use TikTok every day by means of an active screen time control. They can also monitor actively the For You page. They can also restrict comments that are made in the videos created by teenagers. Also the chance for them to meet third parties, their connectability, and also limiting to third parties the videos that the individual teenager likes and prefers. And also, as I said, receiving of direct messages is restricted. After adopting these tools that go through a global panel of experts in the development of teenagers and also in privacy, we decided to go deeper in these configurations. And in January of this year, we launched some more specific configurations based on age groups. So for teenagers from 13 to 15, their accounts is private by default. They can only be followed by individuals that they authorize to follow them, only their friends. Videos, as I said, we also limit these for children under 16, and videos and comments. They can only get comments from friends and nobody else. And the duet function, which is an interesting interacting resource in TikTok, is limited to people above 16. And it is also restricted between 16 and 17, only for friends contacts. We also restrict possibilities of teenagers having their content downloaded. So the content that the teenager creates cannot be downloaded. These are some initiatives that we decided to adopt so that this specific group has a greater experience with TikTok. And in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that for us, privacy and security are not our ultimate objectives. We are always and constantly enhancing and reviewing our initiatives with expert partners that contribute to this constant battle and struggle, which is to ensure privacy to our users. Thank you. Thank you, Marilla. Once again, welcome to our talk today. And I will now invite another very special guest, Miriam Wimmer, so that she can introduce herself and also bring her first comments. Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you. Thank you, Janaína, representing the Alana Institute and ITS, also Marilla and Josh. Rapidly, I am Miriam Wimmer, a white woman with dark, straight hair. I am wearing a white striped blouse with, and I'm wearing glasses. There's a white wall behind me with a little plant and a picture, and I teach about data. And I remember, Janaína, that the last time I participated in one of your dialogues, it was in 2019, before the pandemic. It was a physical event. After our discussion, we were able to join all speakers around a restaurant table, and I hope that the pandemic ends soon so that we can go back to that practice. And this is a very interesting topic for me. And I believe it is very important, as Pedro and as Janaína also mentioned, how children and adolescents are involved voluntary and involuntarily with their interactions in different environments, be it at the school, at home, or even in the streets, walking and interacting with different security cameras and other mechanisms that are a part of our new context. And this has been sped up by the pandemic, no doubt about that. And it's also very visible to me now because I have a 7-year-old son who didn't even know how to use computers before the pandemic. And after a year and a half, he simply won't leave the screen. He wants more games. He wants to buy apps. And Josh also mentioned the interaction between children and the traditional media, especially TV, with the ads. And these challenges become deeper and more complex when we're talking about the digital environment. Pedro also correctly mentioned that we must not protect children from the internet, but in the internet. And it seems that incorporating technology in the schoolroom, in the classroom, and in the home is an irreversible trend. It's part of a much broader phenomenon of digital transformation that impacts our society, governments, and economies as a whole. And it is a very visible thing when we go in a school, we have the surveillance cameras, we have electronic gateways, and we have different learning tools. We have biometry for accessing different places. So technology was very present in our lives before the pandemic, and now it is even more inside the school, I'm talking, and be it for the learning process or for the administration of the school itself. This is a crucial and central characteristic when we assess the impacts on the current generations of children and adolescents. I have been following the millennials and the Z. I'm not exactly a millennial. I'm from the end of the X generation, or Generation X, and I grew up in an environment that was quite different from today. My interactions did not leave any traces by default. I could make mistakes. I could say stupid things in the classroom, and that was not going to be recorded for all eternity, and profiles would not be able to be developed around any foolish thing I say. So we have to consider the risks and benefits. We have both sides, and the ideal is to balance the formula through which we will enable technology to come in contact with our children. Of course, using technology in schools is an irreversible change, and it will bring many benefits. It can produce benefits in the teaching and learning processes. I read recently an article that authors Pfefferbaum and Lehman said that these resources should be incentivized in education to promote the right to education for all. So access to technology is a right of children and adolescents. But on the other hand, as Josh highlighted very well, there is no doubt that technology also produces impacts on the development of personalities of people, especially in this special growing phase, and the impacts are still not very well understood. And I think that in this context, what brings the greatest concern is the possibility that the digital records that are formed in childhood will follow the person throughout his or her life and distinguish good students from bad students, vulnerable teenagers from potential criminals, and that this will be used to persecute, to follow and persecute children throughout their lives, generating very strong impacts along their lives and development. And I think that the most concerning aspect that deserves a greater reflection is the fact that these technologies allow us not only to analyze the performance of children and adolescents, but also making projections with regards to their future skills and behavior. And I would highlight that the instrument that we have now that gives us the greatest comfort is exactly the law for personal data protection. It is not a solution to all problems, but it brings a better balance to this very asymmetrical relationship between children and adolescents and technology, which is something that is so present, necessary, and useful, but also brings risks. So the new law, data protection law in Brazil, brings an ex ante concept of protection of people that can be identified, legislation that authorizes data treatment, that requires several principles be complied, and also establishes a set of rights. And this framework is a tool that we have to ensure that the use of technology is as best as possible and that it maximizes the benefits, which are very good, of course, but also minimizes the risks to which children and teenagers are vulnerable to, especially in this phase of their lives. So these are my first words, and I must also make a disclaimer that my agency, the National Authority for the protection of rights, I bring my ideas, so they are mine own and not necessarily those of my agency. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for your initial comments. It's very good to have such a diversity of perspectives on this topic. And one interesting thing that we can already identify is that we're not demonizing technology. Internet and technology can be very useful and even quite exclusive for children education. Marilla talked about TikTok, which is a platform that can be used to express yourself, your creativity. And Josh reminded us of the limits and the regulation of these limits so that we can minimize the risks without taking away all the benefits that technology brings to this phase of individuals. So beginning with our individual questions for Josh, our question to you is, majority of the app companies, they already include in their service terms and privacy policies the information that use is directed or permitted only for those above 13 years of age. However, we see that there are many younger children in these spaces. How can we ensure protection to children in these environments? And especially, how can we make it compatible with the regulations for data protection?
Thank you for that really important question. I think that this is one of the most crucial issues that we face when it comes to children online is the use of platforms that are made for teenagers and adults by younger children. The risks are many, including from sexual predation, which is a huge problem, obviously, online with children, and something that needs to be taken very seriously. And yet we know that on all the major platforms, there are millions of children who have lied about their age, and they are on the platforms. And I think whether the platforms are doing enough to address that problem is something that's up for debate. And I would say actually they are not doing enough. So what can be done? I mean, first of all, I think it's important to understand that these platforms collect so much data about all of us that they already have a really good idea about who we are and probably how old we are, even if we are a 10-year-old child and we are lying about our age. We see it on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, where kids are using hashtags like 4th grade in their profiles. And these accounts are not taken down, even when we reported many of them. And so it seems very clear that this is a widespread problem. But given that the companies already collect all of this data on children, my question for the platforms is, why do they not use this data in order to kick kids off of the platforms who don't belong there? So we have a situation where the platforms tell their advertisers, we know so much about our users. We know that this person likes football and they like to wear this kind of shoes, and they have short hair, and they are friends with these types of people, and they like to go out on Thursday nights and go to clubs. But then when it comes down to determining the age of a 10-year-old child, they say, oh, we have no way of telling if a child is underage. If they lie, there's nothing that we can do. And in fact, what we know, and I apologize for raising this about TikTok, but TikTok, for instance, we know from a whistleblower last summer that TikTok already classifies the users of the ages of their users using machine learning. And they have classified 1/3 of their users in the US as being under the age of 14. That means that many of those users are under the age of 13 because there's not enough 13-year-olds in the United States for that to be true if they were all between 13 and 14. So TikTok has already figured out that many of their users are probably underage, but they're not using that information to get them off of the platform. They're using that information to personalize content so that they will stay on the platform longer. And I think it's really important to think about how machine learning works, right? The way that you teach a machine to recognize an under 14-year-old is you show them examples of an under 14-year-old, and then you let that machine make inferences so that they can understand and identify other under 14-year-olds. So TikTok had to want to identify these under 14-year-olds, but again, not for the purpose of keeping them off the platforms. So I think the first thing that we need to do is require these platforms to use the data that they're already collecting about all of us in order to make these determinations about who is likely lying about their age. The second thing that I think the platforms could be doing a lot more of is parent education. I see, here in the United States, we do a lot of work with Instagram. Instagram says all the time, oh, we want to keep the 10-year-olds off our platform. We don't want them on Instagram. But to my knowledge, they have never, Instagram, owned by Facebook, right, has the ability to reach every parent at a massive scale and do a public education effort like no other company in the world, right? Facebook has a database of parents that is second to none. And to my knowledge, they have never used that database of parents to say, you know what, if your child is under 13, we really, really, really don't want them on our platforms. So I think we see a lot of double talk from the platforms. They tell regulators that they don't want these underage children on their platforms. But when it comes down to it, those are a lot of users. And it's also a lot of competition, right? So if TikTok cracks down on the 10-year-olds on their platform, then maybe those 10-year-olds are going to migrate to Instagram, and that's not good for TikTok in the long run, and vice versa. So I think we need to, first of all, we need to require the platforms to do more here in the United States. If you are knowingly collecting data from a child under the age of 13 without getting parental permission, that's against the law. So I think we need to see much more enforcement action with really heavy fines that changes the equation for these companies, because right now in the United States, the companies can write off these fines as the cost of doing business. But again, I really think, I don't believe that the platforms are helpless when it comes to the children lying on, getting on there. I think there's so much more they can do. And I hope that, through pressure from regulators, we'll see that start to happen.
Muito obrigada, Josh. Realmente muito bacana ter uma diversidade.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, it's very interesting to have a division. And my next question is for Marilla. And please feel free to answer to any of the questions that Josh asked. I know that you discussed many of the tools and resources that TikTok uses exactly concerning the problems that Josh described. My interest is to learn about possibilities of seeing the business model of the digital market, especially to protect children since a young age. But it's also so important to have the role of regulators besides the platform. So what is the role of the regulators to adjust, to force the platforms to adjust themselves to have two children of their age? And also it would be important to have a design code, as we have the USO, the British authority that designed a very interesting code, and they are right now translating it. And it's the best practice that we can find on how to guide platforms to protect data for children and teenagers and how to regulate their activities. So to you, Marilla, what would be important in the regulation, in the area of regulation, how to make it compatible with your business model and how to protect data for children and adolescents? Thank you for your question, Janaína. Well, repeating our commitment, I think that it's not exactly a compatibility between business model and the legal aspect. This is the basic of our experience of our community at TikTok. They are assumptions for the community to be able to express itself freely and at the same time feeling protected and safe in the platform. So I will repeat our experience at TikTok and in Brazil. Learning and implementing and enforcing the rules that we take very seriously to provide protection and security proper to the age of children using TikTok. So we begin with very strict rules for the children under 13, considering their capacity as individuals, and the rules are adjusted to that child along his or her growth phase, and as they learn how to understand their experience better. That is why we have these age groups. So from 13 to 15, the resources are very limited with regards to what the user can do, protecting them more and ensuring their online experience. As I said, it's by default a private account with no direct messaging, with no lives, where they cannot use certain functionalities of TikTok. And so their experience is more restricted and protected based on their capacity as an individual to be there with their friends, expressing themselves freely, but also learning how to deal with all that. And then when they grow up in their development, we gradually offer more autonomy for them to learn about their online presence and exposure, and giving them a little bit more freedom to make more decisions and to use more functions that are then released to their age. And we also have the family sync function that we consider a very robust tool that enables the family to participate and learn together with a teenager to keep their presence there and to guide them. We know that many times teenagers want to push adults away, as Miriam said. There's the generation gap, but the family sync function enables some form of monitoring and joint learning between the teenager and their parents or tutors. And there is a question on the chat. I don't know if I should answer it, Janaína, about the new family sync resources. I would just like to mention that we have a security central in the app and on our website that includes information and recommendations for parents and tutors on how they can use the family sync, how they can be closer to the teenager. And we also have a youth portal with content not only about safety and security, but also about well-being. Contents that they can use, such as information about their bodies, about bullying, a lot of information that is geared towards learning and how to deal with certain online issues. And we are constantly developing and enhancing these resources, not only for the teenagers, but also for parents and educators. So we are constantly evolving in terms of format and availability of the resources. We have many partnerships. We develop partnerships with the Brazilian civil society, with other experts. We want this context to be exploited by our local community so that it is increasingly proper for our public here. And finally, another resource that is important in TikTok to help this interaction is that since TikTok is a very dynamic interaction with very easy videos that are done by simply sliding your finger on the screen, we have videos that encourage teenagers not to use TikTok for very long. I myself have been exposed to this video several times. They say, oh, you've been here for too long, go do something else. They give these messages. So during TikTok, we also display these videos that explain our guidelines, and the safety videos that also explain our community recommendations and other tools that can be seen in TikTok.
Muito obrigada,
Thank you, Marilla. We have many questions coming in the chat box, and the organizers will be submitting them to us and to Josh and Miriam and Marilla. So if you have questions for Josh, you can also ask in Portuguese, and he has simultaneous translation in English. Our next question is to Miriam. Miriam, we saw that not only in Brazil, but all over the world, there's a kind of search for some form of protection for children and teenagers online. So one type is more based on parents and tutors and their monitoring of the children and teenagers' behavior online. And on the other side, we have the focus on the development of the child and teenagers' maturity. Marilla said that they have a gradual development on TikTok. So it follows the evolution of the maturity of the child. So the second pathway seems to crystallize on the FCO, the age-appropriate design code, AADC, that was developed by the British authorities. So let's talk about how to make this compatible with Brazil with the more proper legal basis for children. Thank you, Janaína. This is a very interesting question. And my first impulse is to say that we should not stick to one or two of these dimensions, but rather to consider that both of them are very important. It is a mistake to focus only on parents' consent and giving them the burden of the responsibility of facing this massacre that children and teenagers suffer online. And on the other hand, using only the mechanisms of helping and monitoring maturing of children is also not very recommendable. So Brazil has chosen to adopt the legislation that is based on these two dimensions. Article 14 of our law says very clearly that the treatment of personal data of children must be done with the specific consent of at least one parent or legal tutor. And we have some qualifications for this consent, showing that it's quite robust. Besides being free and informed consent, it must be highlighted especially. And on paragraph 6, there is a rule that defines that this information on data treatment must be provided in such a manner that the child can understand it. So the law says that it must be simple, clear, and concise, considering the psycho, intellectual, and mental condition of the users, and bring information that is proper not only for the parent and tutor to understand, but also the child. So very clearly, the law expects that the child, him or herself, can learn about the treatment that is given to their personal data, and that is done together with the parent and tutor. And I think that this is a very interesting paragraph. Article 14 of the Brazilian law has been raising several discussions about the different legal bases that it uses, and I will not dare to give you a more conclusive answer now. But what we see on that article in terms of the rationale is also seen in other Brazilian laws. For example, Article 26 says that the constitutional duty of the state with regards to education includes capacity building for a responsible use of the internet. And the civil framework binds this to practicing citizenship. And this is a trend that we see also in the attempt to modernize school syllabus. For those of you who follow the discussions of this legal group, A, B, and C, they also discussed digital culture and other elements of the school syllabus. It was not a total success as we all wished, but it does incorporate the idea of giving more emphasis to subjects that include things such as digital rationale, digital reflection, digital thoughts that are now necessary for children and teenagers. So it seems that the laws are now acknowledging that new technology must be introduced in children's education and in school, not only as learning tools, but as objects for critical reflection to evaluate their role in society, in the inclusion of ethics, social inclusion, ethics, that children are not only an object of technology, but also that they learn to reflect upon its potentials, risks, and limitations. And this comes up even stronger when we consider the principle of the child's best interest. This is present in the Brazilian law and in the International Convention on Children's Rights, in our Constitution. So all these sets of legislations bring these words, this wording that considers children as subjects of right, that they must consider as a priority their interests and rights, and also that they should override other collective interests, such even the parents. So putting the child at the center as an object of legal protection. And when we think about the peculiar situation of children and adolescents with regards to different sets of laws, this allows us to evaluate that the discussion about technology and children should consider different environments, digital environments, school environments that should welcome this perspective of being spaces that allow mistakes without the fear of retaliation, about the profiles that will follow that child throughout their lives. So what these legislations and principles bring in common is the acknowledgement that maturing or growth is a fragile phase, and exactly children and adolescents are in a more vulnerable phase of their lives. Their personality is subject to more risks, and this is how we must think about the use of technology in the home, in the school, and we must also interpret and construe the Brazilian law as a tool for protecting children as more vulnerable human beings, and that the ultimate aim is to develop healthier people. So in a broader sense, I think that we can accommodate the two dimensions you mentioned, and also base that on the best interest of a person who is still in development. Very interesting to hear you with such diverse perceptions of the same phenomenon that we see every day in our lives, and even more strongly the children and adolescents. So they spend more and more time, and they also have a greater and a growing diversity of platforms, and this brings an even increasingly big challenge, not only at home and at school, but also considering the public policies that will be the framework of all these relationships. So I'm learning a lot from you. Now let's have another round of debates and topics. We are arriving at the end. If you are sending in your questions through our chats, they will be sent to our speakers, and our speakers can include them in your comments and answers, covering them if you wish. Now, a question or a reflection to Josh. In the opening today, Josh, you already discussed child or publicity advertising in digital platforms. Some platforms say they are safe for children and adolescents, but many times they also enable the inclusion of ads that are mechanical or sometimes even veiled ads, and also based on personal data and on arts. What would be the possibilities if you understand the business model of the digital world? How could we protect children against child advertising and other forms of commercial exploitation? And also bringing the last point that Miriam discussed, I'd like to hear you talk about the importance of design in the relationship with a child and how the age-appropriate design code that Janaína and others have mentioned, how would that be interesting to make up the legislation and the regulatory discussion?
Thank you, Pedro. Yeah, so a couple of things. Let me start with the second part of your question first about the age-appropriate design code. Like some of the other speakers here today, I am a big fan of the age-appropriate design code. I think right now that is the best set of policies in the world to protect children's privacy. I think the idea of basing it in children's rights is really great, though I will say it's not a concept. Children's rights is not a concept that is very strong in the United States the way it is in the rest of the world, but I still think that that is the framework that we need for regulation. I think the idea in the age-appropriate design code that it says explicitly that you cannot use data in a way that is harmful to a child is an important principle from which all regulation should come from that, and it also allows for regulation to evolve over time as our understanding of what is harmful and what is okay uses of data evolve. So I think, you know, and I also think that it's really crucial that we address this problem from a design perspective, and that we bake into the design of platforms, of apps, of websites, the idea that children have a right to privacy, that it has to be developmentally appropriate for them. And then, you know, I know I've been critical of TikTok, but I do appreciate that TikTok has gone to making some of their privacy features by default, because I think we know that most users will stick with default options. And so just giving parents tools that may be hard to find and require some work to turn on is not the solution. Privacy by default is absolutely, and by design is absolutely the most important thing. To address the second part, or the first part of your question, Pedro, you know, I don't think we should have advertising to children. I think that children are so developmentally vulnerable to advertising that it affects their development, it affects their identities, it affects their physical and emotional, psychological well-being. And we shouldn't allow companies, powerful companies, we shouldn't allow adults using the most powerful technologies ever created to talk directly to children, to try and convince them that they need things in order to be cool or in order to be successful or to be happy. That's just fundamentally unfair. I realize that that might be a bridge too far for many people, so let me suggest a couple of things. First of all, as I said earlier, a design code is a great place to start, one that respects the rights of children and says that fundamentally you have to design your sites. If your site is going to be accessed by children and teenagers, you have to make their well-being a primary consideration. That's really important. I also think, in addition to that, a set of policies that's gaining a lot of traction both in the United States but around the world is banning data-driven advertising to children and teenagers. Even if we don't ban all advertising to children, not using their personal data against them, not doing what I talked about Facebook doing, saying that they can target children when they're feeling bad about themselves. You know, researchers earlier this year were able to buy ads on Facebook targeting teenagers who are interested in smoking, in drinking, in gambling. Nobody wants that. I mean, so I think banning surveillance advertising or data-driven advertising to children and teenagers is really important. And the last thing that I would say is you mentioned the kind of hidden advertising, which is so it's become such an issue. Children, we know their understanding of advertising increases the more it is separated clearly from content. So on children's television, when you have a break and then it goes to a commercial, children understand what is happening at an earlier age and more completely than if that advertising is completely embedded in the program and blurred. So on YouTube, one of the most popular genres for young children are unboxing videos, where children are paid by toy companies, paid by toy stores in order to, and their families are paid to open toys and talk really excitedly about those. 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old children have no understanding of what's going on there. Even if you tell them that the person they are watching has been giving in a toy, they don't have the developmental capacity to understand, okay, this person has been given a free toy, and therefore they are talking really excitedly because they are getting paid to do so, and therefore I should be skeptical about what they're saying. A 6-year-old just isn't ready to do that developmentally. And so I think that, you know, if we're not talking about getting rid of all advertising to children, getting rid of the data-driven advertising and getting rid of the advertising, the influencer marketing that masquerades, that pretends to be something else and is really inherently unfair and deceptive to children, is really important. So there are policies that we could do to address this, but it really involves a fundamental shift to the business model. And so the last thing that I'll say is that the business model that we have for most social media, for most digital media, it does not work for children. It's so much driven around engagement. It's so much driven around data collection, and both of those things, extended engagement and design that encourages children to give up their privacy, to post as much as possible so as much can be inferred about them as possible, is not good for children. So we need to think about other ways for funding media. I hear loud and clear that we live in the 21st century and technology is going to be an important part of how children grow up and develop. But we don't fund other things that are important to children through ways that are harmful for children. We don't fund, you know, doctor's visits for children by making them do something that is bad for them. We don't say that you pay for your education by consuming advertising or other harmful things. So I think if we decide as societies that we want our children to engage with technology, we need to find other ways of paying for it than with children's well-being through advertising. You know, subscriptions are better than advertising funded models in terms of children's well-being, but of course they are extremely exclusionary. Who can afford subscriptions? Only a small fraction of the population. So we need to supplement subscriptions with public funding that gives people access, gives children access to the media that they need in order to be 21st century digital citizens without exploiting them as the current business model does. Thank you.
Obrigado, Josh. E nessa discussão, né, sobre
Thank you very much, Josh. And in the discussion about the design of products and services for children and adolescents, I would like to ask Marilla to comment on how this is important. As Josh mentioned, TikTok stands out with the default design, and by including some default standards that make it easier for the families to understand the dynamics. So increasingly, we see initiatives protecting children in apps or even creating new apps that are specifically for kids or anything for kids. We see already some initiatives in this going along this path with their terms of service and privacy. How do you see this phenomenon of creating specific products for children, especially under 13? Because we must also explain this. In Brazil, we used to separate age groups from 12 up to 12 and then from 13 onwards. In the United States, 13 is an age that became more standard for the division of age groups with regards to laws, publicity, etc. Very good question, Pedro, and thank you. I cannot speak on behalf of other companies, of course, especially those that offer services, and also about other countries. But today in Brazil, we do not have plans of creating a service that is specifically targeted to younger children. We want to keep TikTok for teenagers as the product that we know it as it is, and for children above 13, older than 13. It is a challenge, but it is something that we are highly focused on doing. Josh mentioned some figures that were found, and we also made a public commitment recently that we are going to publish the number of accounts that we are canceling of children or eliminating in our near future transparency reports. We want to bring more information for parents and educators so to help them to prevent children from using TikTok, besides all the different configurations. So the commitment of keeping TikTok a proper platform for teenagers and maintaining our age rule is a constant effort. We have a team fully dedicated to that, to detect and exclude these accounts. And this is our present commitment, to maintain TikTok as a platform for teenagers, as the product is today. There is no future scenario, nothing being developed for children under 13. Thank you, Marilla. I think that this is a challenge we will find, how to balance these spaces and also understanding the repercussion of social media in child development. Many times a persuasive design can impact this public, and we need to understand exactly how. Now, for our second round of questions, Miriam, we want to talk about the government and public services, because the government and all the public services that dialogue with children and adolescents also have a big commitment with the privacy law to respect their interests and their best interests. So my question to you is exactly because during the pandemic, many children and many public schools are using digital platforms to enable distance learning. So my question is, what regulatory measures can you envisage to ensure data protection for these individuals, and at the same time offering through public services? How do these public services and governments make choices to engage children and adolescents? And something that you said in the beginning about the schools during the pandemic. Excellent question, Pedro, and also very complex. I would like to, before make reference to some questions I received from the chat. Julia and Kellen raised some issues about the absolute relative capacity of children and adolescents and their capacity to understand the privacy law and its wording. I want to say that, in fact, we have not reached a conclusion, neither in the academia nor in the law, about what is the basic problem. The basic problem is that there are parts of the law that mention children and adolescents, but only 2 times. And for the rest of the wording, it mentions children without separating children and adolescents. So people have this curiosity whether if it was a deliberate mistake, if it was something deliberate or if it was a mistake. I believe that the legislators do want to acknowledge the importance of teenagers or adolescents in the digital world, but this also generates a problem with regards to construing the law, because a child, even a teenager, under 16 is relatively incapable of making important decisions. Many times they can drive or vote, but they cannot buy an apartment, for example. So I've seen very good arguments for both sides, and it does deserve a deeper dive, and I don't have an answer for that right now about the wording. Now, going on to answer your question, Pedro, it's a very important topic, and before we reflect about the provision of protection of data in the public services and government, we also have to discuss access to the internet and broadband, because unfortunately during the pandemic, many times schools had to resort to online classes, and this ended up deepening the gap between people with higher income, lower income, people in the metropolitan areas and more remote areas with regards to access. So this is something that we must think about when we talk about protecting the rights of children and adolescents in the digital world. Your question is very interesting because it touches on 2 points. On the one hand, we discuss the treatment of personal data by the public powers, by government. So how can schools think about this? And there is a whole separate chapter in the Brazilian law about that with regards to public policies and the specific needs, limitations to secondary uses, and besides all the principles that apply to the public service, such as safety, security, etc. This is a set of concerns that is still in the beginning of its discussion, because the pandemic accelerated a change for which we were not prepared. Everybody had to undergo this change suddenly, and if it was a challenge for people with higher income, you can imagine what happened to people with lower income and also public schools and communities. And the second part of your idea is also regards the providers of these services, large companies that offer these services in different countries, and how they treat personal data of underage people in different environments. So one very important path that we must think about and think more deeply about is exactly the self-regulation and co-regulation measures that are enabled by the Brazilian data privacy law, and it imposes a lot of pressure on accountability, transparency, etc. And LGPD, the Brazilian law, also includes private codes of conduct that will be recognized and acknowledged by the authority. And when we read the law, we see that it is based on a more responsive aspect of the regulation. The behavior of the regulator will depend on the behavior of the regulated. So that's where we see the idea of code of conduct, privacy, design, that other speakers mentioned. I did some research and I saw that there are some models of declarations and commitments that can be used, such as the Student Privacy Pledge and others, just giving one example. But the idea is that you can have commitments for the players themselves in the sense of not using more data than necessary, not marketing the data or commercializing the data, which is obvious, not building students' profiles for anything beyond that specific need that was justified, not keeping data online for longer than necessary. So this toolbox that the law gives us regarding transparency, the rights to access, transparency, the elimination of personal data, they should also be incorporated by the companies that provide education. And this would contribute greatly to increased trust from parents and tutors with regards to the use of their children's data in these environments. These are my considerations. I think that this discussion is not closed, of course, and the challenge we have ahead of us is to find a midterm that is not too much excitement with technology, but also not too much pessimism and desire to abandon technology once and for all, but rather having a balance and providing education which is emancipatory and especially helps the development of these individuals. Excellent, very good to hear you. And we are now arriving at this very important consensus, which is not only safety by design, transparency by design, but what we really want to reach is safety by design, or safety of children by design. And we have to look at the cyberspace and understand the importance of the law, of the market, corporations, and the architecture and design that will make up this very complex space for protecting children and adolescents. Now, Janaína, I think we can read some of the questions from our public. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our dialogue, and very unfortunately, because it's a very long and broad subject, but I hope that we can come back to our physical veranda events, talking around the table, looking at each other eye to eye. Yes, Pedro, for sure. This is something we are wishing for. The veranda sessions, I really miss them. If you have been to one of them, you will remember the food. The sweets were wonderful. The brigadeiros, a Brazilian chocolate sweet. And so we're going to read some of your questions, but please keep coming with your questions. If you have questions for Josh, you can ask them in Portuguese. And my first question is exactly for Josh, but we'll try to cover some more. I would like to thank Miriam for her last comments. We see many appraisals to you. You're being so balanced. Besides thinking about the data protection, we have to think about technology also and the benefits it brings to children and adolescents, especially in Brazil, where we saw during the pandemic that many children and adolescents don't even have access to the internet. Josh, your question. Christiane wants to know your opinion on children and teenagers' privacy violation in the phenomenon called flame flogging. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, yes, family video logging. Yes, and first of all, I have to say you made me very hungry describing the food at your in-person events. But and I hope to come to one someday. But yeah, so I think I think that's a great question, and I think this is another situation where it really points to the need for regulation. You know, I understand why a family would be tempted to there's a significant amount of money that can be made by broadcasting your family's life on YouTube or on other social media channels. And I can understand why that would be very tempting. At the same time, that's one reason why we have laws that protect children from exploitative labor and other exploitation. And we actually have a situation here. I don't know what the Brazilian law is around these videos, but in the United States, a child, what they can do in terms of acting in a movie or a television show, there's very strict laws about how many hours they can work and what happens to the money that they make, and protections to keep their parents from exploiting them in the entertainment business. But those regulations do not apply to the internet, to family logging on YouTube. And so I think that's a clear case where, you know, the regulations on the internet are just behind the actual practices, and that's a clear case where children are being exploited. They're growing up with their entire life online. I can't imagine what it's going to be like for those children, you know, 10 to 15 years down the road, when everything they've done, you know, embarrassing things, maybe humiliating things, are now available for the world to see for the rest of their life. And I think that's a situation where children need to be protected from the understandable impulse of their parents, to try and make some money and to try and be famous. And so that's a clear case where we need regulation. You know, I don't point the fingers at the families. I point the finger at the failure of our society to enact regulations that would protect children in that circumstance, the same way that we have done in film and television.
Obrigada, Josh. Muito obrigada pela
Thank
sua
you, Josh. Thank you for your answer. And we have some more questions. Have you selected one, Pedro?
Eu acho que uma coisa, ponto que foi levantado aqui.
One point that was raised here,
A Miriam comentou, mas seria ótimo.
and Miriam discussed it. I think we could go back to it because there's a big trend towards the consent, or you see informed consent, or consent as a big magic word. Kellen Xavier asks us how the Brazilian law considers the consent. We understand the formal meaning, but how should we look at consent under the legal basis for data treatment? You already touched upon that, but I think we must emphasize that we must go beyond this consent. Yes, Pedro, this is a very appropriate rationale, and it is very common to see that people that are not experts in law think that consent is a solution for everything, even family issues. Nobody asked for my consent. I did not give my consent. And it is something that brings about the self-information, which is a principle in our legislation, to the non-consent of using personal data. And I think that historically, the development of the data protection laws, again, along the last 5 decades, show us that consent is very fragile, because you can consent to anything. It is impossible to read all those terms of service and privacy terms, and you don't understand all that, and you rush through it, and you give your consent. And in the Brazilian law, it is a very specific thing, and especially for children and adolescents, it must be highlighted. So what has been coming up on more mature discussions about data protection is the idea that there is no hierarchy between and among the legal bases. I'm not talking about children and adolescents specifically, but also based on other legal hypotheses that legitimate certain treatment, and that must certainly be surrounded and by that protective network that the Brazilian law brings. And this is a very complex discussion in the case of children and adolescents, because it refers very explicitly to consent. So it goes against all the principles of the law that give equal hierarchy to other legal bases. So the discussion that is still not resolved in the law, and of course, I don't think I should even go too deep on this, is that it would be the idea that children would be more protected because they have a more special consent, whereas other types of data that are also sensitive and must be protected can be treated based on other legal bases, on different legal bases. There are different legal positions about this. Some understand the parent's consent as a qualifier of Article 7 that enables data protection for children and adolescents based on contracts and legitimate interests and other hypotheses. I have also seen it construed in the following way, that children and adolescents data should always be considered sensitive data. And I've seen a different interpretation that says that consent is something that exists and that you have to deal with it or change the law. So I believe that the only consensus we have in this confusion is that whatever interpretation, it must take into account the best interest of the children. So I don't know if I brought clarity or more confusion, but this is what we have. Very important. I like your last sentence that in spite of the discussion, the main or the title of Article 14 is overriding. That is, although there's a hierarchy when we speak of children and adolescents, that the best interest must always prevail. Even if there is parent consent, the best interest should prevail. This goes along the lines of a recent UN document on children's rights, which also puts this question at the center of the topic, especially when it deals with children. Well, with regards to the best interest, there's also a relationship with the idea of having parents' consent as the only legal basis when we see things, phenomena such as the vlogging that Josh explained, when the parents consider that that is good, but it is actually not to the best interest of the child. So that would lead us to review the idea of parents' consent as the greatest, the top protection for children and adolescents. A very good reflection. Thank you, Miriam. Janaína, do we have any more questions? I see we only have 5 more minutes. Exactly. We have many very interesting questions, but we only have 4 minutes to go. So let's go on to our final round. Okay, so I want to thank Miriam, Marilla, and Josh again for having discussed such an important topic with us, with different visions that are also complementary, and that the best interest and the rights of children and adolescents should be first, should come first. Alana has this duty as society, with the families, with the state, to ensure the rights of children as an absolute priority. This article is the most important for us in our Constitution, and at Alana, we focus on Article 227 of our Constitution because it shows a project for a society, a country, and also a digital project, and putting children in the first place in their best interest, not only good for the children, for their families, but for all of society. And I believe that was very clear through our discussion. And we hope that we can go on building regulatory paths to protect children in the digital world and also offline. I will invite our speakers for their last comments, beginning with Marilla. Thank you, Pedro. Reiterating once again our thanks to Alana and ITS for giving us the opportunity to learn so much from this discussion. As I said before, for us at TikTok, ensuring that our tools and our ideas regarding safety, protection, and privacy are proper to the different stages of development, and that we are open to partnerships with the civil society in this exchange with Alana, with ITS, and with Miriam also at ANPD, and also with Josh. When we are When we find ourselves in uncomfortable situations, that is when we learn the most. And ultimately, all the users will be benefited. So we want to ensure to them the best possible experience to interact creatively. And I made many notes about what Josh and Miriam said here so that we can learn even more. Josh?
So thank you to Alana and ITS for hosting such a rich discussion, and I learned a lot as well. I really appreciate the discussion around what is the best interest of the child and the agreement that needs to come first. I would just add that for me, I think that it is if we're going to talk about the best interest of the child, we really need to look at the business model for digital media. And we need to ask ourselves, is the business model itself in the best interest of the child? Because we can, we can put in some protections to try and lessen the effects of it. But I think it's really important to ask those hard questions about, is the business model the best that we can do for children? And I don't think it is. The other thing that I will say is, I'm heartened by the discussion of the age-appropriate design code and the talk of new legislation and new regulations. But it's also really important. Enforcement becomes such a critical issue. Here in the United States, we have a decent children's privacy law. It's not enforced. More than 50% of the apps in the Google in the children's section of the Google Play Store are violating our children's privacy law here in the United States. So without really rigorous enforcement, all the best intentions, all the best laws will be meaningless. We need companies to be very limited in the data that they collect. We need them to be transparent about what they're doing with that data. And really importantly, we need them to delete that data when they have already used it for the purpose of which it's been collected. One of the things that we see here in the United States is that once companies collect data, they keep it forever unless you demand that they delete it. But that's not the way it should work. With children's data, if at the second that you're done processing that data for the purpose you collected it, that data should be deleted so that we don't have a digital footprint of a child following them around for the rest of their life. So thank you again for the discussion, and I'm excited to see where this takes us all.
Muito obrigado, Josh. Miriam?
Queria só realmente agradecer.
Thank you very much, Josh. Miriam, I only want to thank you, Pedro and Janaína, and my colleague speakers, Marilla and Josh, that got me thinking about some new aspects. I hope we can go on with our debates. And in 2022, when we end the regulatory cycle of the law, I am sure that we will have many more rounds of discussion. So coming back to this discussion and inviting other participants who can help us to think more operationally about the protection of data for children and teenagers. Thank you very much. Thank you. And let's bring an end to our wonderful discussion today with Janaína. Thank you for your discussions, for your excellent comments and perspectives. Very reinvigorating to have such a wealth of experiences. Thank you so much, Marilla, Miriam, Josh. I learned a lot from you. Thank you to our public. We hope that very soon we can be all together physically and eat many brigadeiros. And let's wait for the new chapters of the regulator, ANPD in Brazil, and how they will deal. There is still a lot of controversy about regulations, and we will wait for the agency's new actions. Thank you all. Have a good evening. And for those of you who did not have your questions answered, we apologize, and we hope we can answer all of them next time. Bye-bye, everyone. Take care and take your vaccines.